Hello everyone, this is the lecture on understanding the research process. We have four main objectives for this lecture. Number one, to try and understand the various steps of the research process. Number two, to recognize the different types of research questions that are out there. Number three, to understand factors that must be considered when selecting a research question. And number four, recognizing the different types of variables and taking our first look at independent and dependent variables. So this chapter is all about that very first and probably the most important step of identifying a research question for your study, or for any study that you're going to do, not just for this class, and then figuring out a purpose or research questions that go along with that, and then identifying the variables in your study. So this is very important stuff, because if you're not able to identify a research question and the types of variables associated with that research question, then you're going to have trouble designing your study and coming up with the appropriate methodology. So we've previously discussed the stages of the scientific method, and we talked about that the first step is to identify our question, which is the focus of this lecture, then to form our hypothesis or hypotheses if we have multiple research questions, to develop our research plan, to collect our data, and then to analyze our results and draw our conclusions. Those are the generally accepted stages of the scientific method, and the generally accepted stages in any kind of master's, thesis, or doctoral dissertation. So different textbooks will give you somewhat slightly different steps in conducting the research. The number of steps varies in those different processes that have been put out there, and some of the textbooks combine 2 or 3 of the steps into one. The textbook that we use gives us a couple of examples. One they give us is on page 30. They provide us with 12 steps. And I know that's pretty intimidating when I first pull this slide up to see 12 steps. But if you really follow through each one of these steps, it makes sense. It's pretty logical. Number one, you identify the research question. So again, that's the focus of this lecture, to try and help you to begin to think what you would like to do your research proposal on. In this course, one of my main goals is to try and get you to apply the content. Yes, I want you to memorize stuff, so you know what variables are, you know what different methodologies are. But the real power in this course comes from you applying the content and designing your own study and following the systematic process that we talked about already. So step one, identify the research question. Number two, conduct an initial review of literature. Has that study been done before? What did they do? What did they find? What did they recommend future researchers do? Number three, distill the question to a researchable problem. Okay, and that can be tricky because you have to go from pretty broad to very specific. Number four, conduct a continued review of literature based on your researchable problems that you've identified. Formulate hypotheses or hypotheses. From that, you'll determine the basic research approach. Is it quantitative? Is it qualitative? Are you going to do interviews? Or are you going to use a survey? Number 7, then you need to identify the population that you're going to draw your sample from and how you're going to do that. Then you're going to design a data collection plan. And then you're going to select or develop data collection instruments. Then you're going to choose a method for analyzing your data. Once you've done all that, you implement the research plan, you conduct the study, and then you get your results and you interpret them. So lots of steps, 12 steps. 12 steps of research. Again, I'm not gonna say to you on a test, what's step 8 in the 12 steps of research? Okay, it's not very important that you memorize the exact order of each of these steps. What's more important is that you look at them, you try to understand, okay, that makes sense. I have a research question, and then this is what I do, and then this is what I do. So it begins with a question. Okay, it begins with a question. This is very, very important, okay, because without a good question, you can't go anywhere. So a researcher begins to search, begins to look, and begins to think about what you would like to do a study on. Sometimes it comes naturally, but for some of you it won't. The selection of a research question is quite often a major source of anxiety and frustration for students in this class and for graduate students who are required to do a study in their graduate program. Remember, in this class you're writing a research proposal. You're not doing the study. You're just writing a proposal on how you would do your study if you were to do it. Perhaps next semester you could do it as a DIS, or you could do it as part of your master's degree in graduate school, but in this class you're just proposing what you could do. The book states, and I would agree with this, that students typically fall into one of 3 categories when it comes to selecting a research question. Category 1, those who know precisely what they want to do and have a well-conceived problem. Congratulations if you're in that group. Number 2, those who have many interest areas but are having difficulty deciding exactly what they want to study. And then number 3, students who do not have any idea about a worthwhile research question. So you're probably in one of those groups. Either you know exactly what you want to do, or you have just lots of ideas and you don't know which one to do, or number 3, you have no idea whatsoever. And that's okay. Whichever one of those groups you're in right now, that's okay. I've seen it before. You will come up with something and you will write a proposal and everything will be fine. So there's lots of ways that you can go trying to find your question if you don't have one that's jumping out already. I found that when I ask the question in class, what are you interested in researching? Most student answers are very, very broad. Things like strength training, exercise physiology, sports psychology, athletic training. So they're very vague and they don't relate well to a specific research question. The challenge is for you to identify a specific question from within those broad problem areas. So where do we get the research question from? Questions often arise from issues, controversies, concerns, problems that need to be solved. Curiosity is as good as a motivational factor as any. For example, the book tells us about a former graduate student who was interested in the broad area of dietary disorders, and specifically anorexia and bulimia. The student was curious about whether the attitude began that led to the development of these disorders in teenagers and young adults. Is it possible that dietary problems are rooted in childhood? Such curiosity led to an excellent study in which an attempt was made to determine and compare body image perceptions and preferences among male and female pre-adolescent children. So from this initial curiosity in anorexia and bulimia, a definitive problem was identified. So there's been lots of methods for finding worthwhile research questions that have been suggested to students by their professors over the years. The book on page 32 and 33 give you some ideas on where you can get your research questions from, and I'll share a few of these with you. Number 1, write out your philosophy of the exercise science or physical education or whatever your degree is, of that field in which you are studying. Divide the field into its several parts and study them. When you come to something you would like to know but do not know, write it down for your research hope chest. So start collecting things that you see that you think need to be studied in more detail. Number 2, in lectures, discussions at all times, write down at once any ideas that come to you. So I would recommend that you keep a little notepad, or you can do it on your phone or your iPad. Have a little page open where if you think of something, you write it down straight away. Before you know it, you'll have 10 to 15 ideas that you can begin to think through and take one of them and run with it. With what in your field are you dissatisfied with? What problems does it suggest? Investigate these. Analyze, challenge, and criticize the popular beliefs and practices in your field of interest. What procedures or practices in your field interest you? Observe the problems inherent in some of these procedures and practices that could be researched. Browse reference and bibliographical lists in books, journals, magazines, and theses. Just running down a list of titles frequently sparks a viable idea for a research problem. So you might just want to go online, go to Google Scholar, and search for exercise science research studies, or be more specific than that, interval training research studies. See what you find. See what other people have done. That might provoke some kind of ideas for you. And then finally, talk to your professors or other professionals that work in your interest area. You will find that most professors have an abundance of ideas about potential research problems, and they generally like talking about them. Or if you're interested in becoming a physical therapist, go speak to a physical therapist that you might know out in the field. Tell them you have to do a research study. Well, you don't have to do the study, you just have to propose it. But ask them what they think needs to be studied. Ask them if they have any ideas. So other people, go find other people and see what kind of research ideas they might have for you. Okay, I think I'm going to skip this slide. I used to talk through this, but I think it's a little bit confusing. It's basically the 12 steps of research in a graphical kind of flowchart format. Alright, types of research questions. Okay, types of research questions. Sorry, bouncing around there a little bit. Here we go. So it's possible to group research questions into 3 basic categories: descriptive questions, relationship questions, and difference questions. You might ask, well, why do we need to do that? Why do we always need to categorize everything? Well, being able to identify the basic type of research question being asked helps us to understand the very nature of research. It helps us to understand the preferred research design and methodology that's best used for the type of question, and the appropriate methods for analyzing the data. So if we know what type of question we have, we know best practices, the type of research design and analysis to use with that type of question. So let's spend some more time to look in depth at these 3 types of research questions. Excuse me for a second. Okay, descriptive questions. They simply seek to describe phenomena or characteristics of a particular group of subjects being studied. Such questions describe or answer the question, what is? We've already talked about that in our previous lecture. Data are typically gathered by asking questions of a group of individuals, observing their behaviors, or measuring or testing their performance on certain tasks. Descriptive questions are often the basis for survey research as well as qualitative research. An example of research centered around a descriptive question is illustrated by the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, sponsored by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This consists of national, state, and large school district surveys of representative samples of high school students. It's conducted every 2 years, and the surveys monitor health risk behaviors among young people so that health education agencies can more effectively target and improve programs. So a lot of survey type research is done through, or relates well to descriptive questions. Some examples. What are the attitudes of rural parents towards the inclusion of sexuality education in the school curriculum? So, your idea might have been that you're interested in sex ed in schools. So we've narrowed that down into a more specific research question. So in this study, they wanted to look at the attitudes of rural parents towards the inclusion of sex ed. So they probably did that through some kind of questionnaire. They didn't need to put people into groups to do different things with different groups. All they needed to do was try and find a representative sample of the population so that they could say with some degree of confidence that the results that they found from their sample could be generalized to the larger population of rural parents. There's other examples on page 34. Let's review some of them, and you can follow along with your book if you have it in front of you. How do first-year physical education teachers perceive the effectiveness of a mentoring program on their professional growth and teacher development? So in that study, I would imagine that they either interviewed or surveyed first-year PE teachers and asked them questions about a mentoring program that they were in, and looked at their perceptions on whether that program helped them with their professional growth and development. What is the extent of perceived ethnic cultural violence among students in middle and high schools? What are the perceived barriers to leisure time physical activity participation among Australian adults? Okay, all descriptive type questions. Here's one that I like. What do physical education teachers think about the effect of block scheduling in secondary school physical education classes? Again, these are descriptive questions because they're describing what is. What's the current situation? They're not looking at what will be. They're not manipulating independent variables. They're not taking people, randomly putting them into groups and doing different things with each group. They're just looking at the current situation, or the what is. Difference questions. Difference questions seek to make comparisons between or within groups. They ask the question, is there a difference? This type of question tends to be associated with experimental research, and at the simplest level involves the researcher comparing an experimental group that has been exposed to some kind of treatment to a control group that has not received the treatment. Similarly, comparisons could be made between pre-test and post-test performance, and difference questions may also be the basis for a non-experimental research in which the researcher is interested in comparing one group to another on the basis of existing characteristics. For example, Fawcett and colleagues use self-administered surveys to compare 4th grade boys and girls out-of-school physical activity levels and choices of activities. Okay, that was already pre-established data. So difference questions, this is the experimental type research. This is the trendy kind of research, fun research, because you're putting people into groups and you're doing different things with those groups, unless it's already a pre-existing condition. Does participation in Special Olympics affect the self-esteem of adults with mental retardation? Okay, so I would imagine in this study they found some adults with mental retardation, and some of them participated in Special Olympics and some of them didn't, and maybe they looked at pre to post for both of those groups to see if there was a change in the self-esteem of adults in the group that did Special Olympics and compared it to the change from pre to post in the group that didn't do Special Olympics. And then they would try to control as many other variables as they could so that they could say at the end with some degree of confidence that any change in the self-esteem of those adults with MR was due to their participation in Special Olympics. Some other examples on page 35 in your textbook, and that's in the 5th edition. It might be a slightly different page in the 4th edition. Do expert and novice dancers use similar strategies to learn appropriately challenging routines in domain-relevant conditions? Does performing a forward lunge with a long step result in greater forces acting on the cruciate ligaments than performing a forward lunge with a short step? Is there a difference in physical activity levels between adults with and without mental retardation? How does intrinsic motivation towards physical fitness testing differ according to award status and gender of upper elementary school children? So again, difference questions. They're the type of research questions seeking to determine if there are differences between or within groups. Relationship questions. These investigate the degree to which two or more variables co-vary or are associated with each other. Rather than comparing groups, typically the researcher obtains measurements on two or more variables for a group of subjects and then computes some index of association, which is often called a correlation coefficient. The intent of these questions is simply to determine the extent to which the variables are related and not to establish cause and effect. Some work done by Welk and colleagues in 2003. They investigated the relationship between various parental influences and children's physical activity and provided a good illustration of a relationship question. Some more examples are provided on page 36 in addition to the one on the slide here. Is there an association between self-esteem and eating behaviors among collegiate female swimmers? What is the relationship between class size, lesson context, and student engagement in physical activity during middle school physical education class? Is physical activity in childhood and adolescence a predictor of physical activity in young adulthood? So some relationship question examples there. Again, relationship questions, they're the type of research questions that seek to investigate the relationship or association between two or more variables. There is no manipulation of the independent variable in relationship type questions. You're just looking at the relationship between two or more variables. So, once the research question has been selected, we must take this question and begin a process of distilling the question down into carefully defined problem statements that we can go ahead and research. Like we've talked about already, this process commences with a background review of literature, so we can see what kind of research has been done before. Also, we should also begin to think about the problem statement and how we go from a research question to a problem statement and whether the problem statement is suitable and whether it's a good problem statement. And the book gives us 3 primary criteria to use when we're trying to make a final determination as to whether or not the problem that we've come up with should be studied. First of all, and the most important criteria, is your interest in the problem. So it's only a good research problem or research question turned into a research problem if it's of major interest to you. Okay, so what we're talking about here is taking your research questions and turning them into research problems. And it's the most important part of this is that it's generally something that is interesting to you. If it's not, then it's not going to be something that you're going to want to invest a lot of time in. I'm not necessarily talking about this course. I'm talking about a master's thesis or doctoral dissertation. The amount of time that you will spend on a thesis in graduate school, or a dissertation, or even an honors project as an undergrad, it's a lot of hours. And if you're not into it, if you're not personally invested in it, then you're not going to do a good job. For example, for my doctoral dissertation, I was fascinated and passionate about the education of children with special needs in general physical education classes. As a teacher in schools for 3 years, I noticed that we, teachers in general, new teachers, were unprepared on how to teach children with different mental and physical disabilities in our classes. And I also noticed that even though I was willing to try and I had a positive attitude, there were a lot of teachers around me that just felt those kids shouldn't be in our classes. And I felt that that affected the students' ability to be successful in the classes. So in my dissertation, I designed a mixed method study which was quantitative and qualitative, where I looked at how the attitude of teachers towards inclusion or mainstreaming affected the success rate of students in the courses. Now, I spent a whole year on that. That's what you do with a dissertation. You take 3 years of classes, and then a 4th year is just writing and doing your study. And I traveled all over Northern Virginia, down to Richmond, and up and down I-95 and around the Beltway. And interestingly, I was doing that as the Beltway sniper was active in the DC area, if you remember that. And I didn't mind doing it because I was very passionate. I was interested in that research problem. So number one, the most important variable or criteria for selecting a research problem is it has to have personal interest to you. Number two, is the problem worthwhile? Again, we're talking about taking a research question, turning it into a researchable problem. So there's lots of things to think about here when we answer the question, is the problem worthwhile? Does the problem and its potential solution make a contribution to the body of knowledge within the field of study? We have to ask that question. Is the research problem timely? Is there a demand for a solution to the problem? And then thirdly, is the problem manageable? You might come up with a great idea, and I see this a lot in this course, and I see it a lot with students who want to do DISs. You might come up with a research problem, but it's just too big, and it's too many variables, and you want to do things that it's just not manageable. I've had students that have wanted to draw blood from people to measure different levels to compare their physiological response to exercise by looking at the levels of different things within the blood. I've had students who have wanted to do all kinds of physiological testing that we just don't have access to the equipment to do. So we need to make sure we don't pick a research problem that we don't either have the expertise, the time, or the resources to actually conduct. And we also need to make sure we avoid any personal bias as we decide upon our research problems. So we go from a research question to a research problem or problems, and then from that we come to actually making a statement about the purpose of our study. The research problem is developed in the introductory sections of the research report and is typically identified in a purpose statement that expresses the goals of the research study. And a purpose statement is the most important statement in a research proposal, as well as in the final thesis, dissertation, or research paper. The purpose statement indicates the researcher's intent for conducting the research study. And according to Locke, Spirduso, and Silverman, they said that a purpose statement expresses why you want to do the study and what you intend to accomplish. It's typically found as the last sentence or near the end of the introductory section. A well-written purpose statement should identify the key variables to be investigated and provide some information about the scope of the study, such as who are the research participants, what's the setting, what's the treatment, and the purpose statement tells us what is to be done in the study. A purpose statement may take a variety of forms, but usually begins in a manner similar to some of those listed on this slide. The problem of this study was to. The study was concerned with. The study is designed to. The purpose of this investigation is to. So what you'll notice is that some of these are written in the past tense, as in the study was already done, or some of them might be written in the present tense, such as the purpose of this study is to. Now, this would depend on your advisor when you get to grad school and what they want. For this course, I don't mind if you write in the present tense, future tense, or past tense as long as you stay consistent. It would make sense to probably write it in the future tense. The purpose of this investigation is to. The reason that some advisors allow their students to write it in the past tense in the proposal is because at the end, when they write it up, when they finish the study and they submit it for publication, at that point it will all have to be in the past tense because the study will have been done, conducted, and wrapped up. So rather than have it write it in the future tense at the start and then change it to the past tense at the end of the study, they just allow them to write in the past tense at the start. I hope that makes sense. And read the bottom of page 38 if you need that to be clarified a little clearer. So let's look at some examples of problem statements. The problem was to investigate the effects of exercise on blood lipids among college-age females. The present study was designed to identify those characteristics which differentiate between students who binge drink and those that do not. The problem of the study was to determine, is there a relationship between self-efficacy and self-reported leisure activities among middle-aged adult females? And there's a few more on page 39. The goal of this study was to determine whether Colorado on the Move could produce short-term increases in lifestyle physical activity. The purpose of this study was to report cardiovascular fitness levels as measured using the 20-meter shuttle run test for youths 8 to 18 years of age from a Midwestern metropolitan area. Second, we make comparisons between Midwestern youths' 20-meter shuttle run performance and their U.S. and international counterparts. The purpose of the present study was to examine the stability of physical self-perceptions across a short period of time. The purposes of this study were to A. describe the prevalence of participation in moderate to vigorous physical activity and overweight and obesity, and B. to examine the associations between physical activity and weight status in students in a rural university. So you can see that these questions, they express the researcher's intent or goal for conducting the study, and that they indicate the variables of interest and some information regarding the participants and setting of the study. So here's some examples from studies that I've done and some of my colleagues have done. And this one was actually with a local PE teacher, because we did it in his school. Our title was Assessing Relationships. This was a relationship question between weight training, self-esteem, and health-related physical fitness in high school students. And in our abstract, we went straight in with our purpose statement. The purpose of this study was to assess the relationships between weight training and self-esteem among high school students. A psychological assessment, the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale, was completed by 120 students in a high school located in the southeastern United States. 80 high school students participating in a weight training class were pre- and post-tested for muscular strength, and 40 students served as a control group and did not participate in any weight training during class. Okay? And if you're really interested in that study, I can share it with you. Here's another one, and this one goes back. This was actually a branch off of my dissertation. Excuse me. So the purpose statement is in the intro, but it will also show up in your abstract. The purpose of this study was to ascertain the relationship between teachers' attitudes towards the inclusion of children with mild to moderate mental disabilities in PE settings, the amount of practice attempts performed, and the levels of success attained by these students compared to their peers without disabilities. So you can see here that I've tried to explain who the people are in my study. It's children with mild to moderate mental disabilities and teachers. I've tried to explain what I'm measuring, which is practice attempts and success rates of those, and I've tried to explain the variables within this. The other half of the abstract just tells you what was found. Here's one that we published also 3 or 4, actually 5 years ago now. This was actually a student-led paper. I did it. Here's our student, and then myself and Dr. Boyce and Dr. Combs, who many of you know, helped out with this study too. The title was Physical Fitness Comparisons of the Charlotte Meck Fire and Police Departments, and Dr. Boyce has done several of these types of studies since. So let's find our purpose statement. Here it is. The purpose of this investigation was to compare body composition and bench press strength between firefighters and police officers in the Charlotte Meck departments. Okay, basically just comparing policemen to firemen. So we took some existing data that was out there, and it was a big data set. And we went through this, and we found some differences. We found a lot of big differences in the physical fitness of firefighters versus police officers. And if you want to read it, I can send the whole study to you. But from this actually came a recommendation for policy, because firefighters were actually given time allocated during the day, i.e. paid time to work out. Police officers weren't. If police officers were going to work out, it had to be on their own time off the clock. And with the need for police officers to be fitter, as displayed by the figures that we found in this study, I think Charlotte Meck, the police department, put in a request to include some paid time for physical fitness activities. Pretty interesting. And in fact, that study has been downloaded more than any other study that many of us around here have done, because police departments and fire departments have used studies like this to make a case for policy change. Here's one that we just did a couple of years ago, and this was with a former athletic trainer here at UNCW. and she was working with a men's soccer team who was having a lot of injuries. So she was personally interested in the injury rates and ankle injuries and knee injuries of UNCW soccer players. So she learned this new warm-up routine that's well documented, and it's out there. It's called the PEP warm-up routine. If you Google it, you'll find it's a series of stabilization and strengthening activities. So she did this for a couple of years with a men's soccer team and looked at whether it decreased the incidence of ankle injuries. So her purpose statement, which is what we're talking about here, was to investigate the effectiveness of the PEP program in decreasing the incidence of ankle injuries in male soccer players. So her big idea was that she was concerned about ankle injuries. Then she turned it into a research question and then into this purpose statement. Here's one that a bunch of us did. The purpose of this study was to examine the meaning women attribute to physical activity which assists them in maintenance of such activity, and identify the relationship of the role of multiple dimensions of health as motivators for participating in physical activity. It's a little bit wordy, but you can see it's another study that we've done where you have to give a purpose statement. You have to have a person. Oh, sorry, not sure what happened there. Hopefully this is still recording. Here's another example. Purpose of this study was to determine the perception of the impact of the PEP grant, unrelated to the previous PEP, that's just a coincidence, on physical education programs of 4 elementary schools through interviews with teachers and principals. Okay, so this was a qualitative study, and we're talking about perceptions, but those kinds of studies still have to have a purpose statement. Here's one from recreation. The purpose of this study is to explore and understand the mixed viewpoints on the sustainability of cruise tourism in Key West through a case study approach. Okay, so it's a nice statement that gives us some idea about the intent or goal of the study and introduces variables of interest and possibly who the participants in the study are going to be. The purpose of this study was to examine how residents in Indianapolis perceive the impacts that sport tourism has upon their city. Okay, I don't know if you'll be able to see this slide that well on ShareStream, but you'll see it on the PowerPoint slide that is on Blackboard too. So this is from last spring, and it's a few of the students in exercise science students that were in this class, and I'll share more of this as we move through the course. These are some of their titles that they came up with for their research proposals. Okay, I obviously collect all of these as well as the finished product. And I show you this to try and get you thinking about your research questions for this course. So let's look through a few of these. Massed versus distributed workout schedules on muscular strength gains in college students. This actually came from this student took PD 350 with me, where we talked about massed versus distributed schedules, and he wanted to do an experimental study where he put students into 2 groups. One had a massed schedule, one had a distributed schedule, and looked at which had the most muscular strength gains in college students over a period of time. Let's see here. The effect of strength training and speed agility training on 40-yard dash times of collegiate intramural sports participants. So I think Kyle, this is a nice title, and we'll talk about titles more later, because it identifies the participants, the subjects, the collegiate intramural sports participants. It introduces the dependent variable which is the 40-yard dash time. It introduces the independent variable, which is the type of training program. Jennifer, here's a nice study. The social, emotional, and physical benefits to participate in a regular yoga class for a healthy population. I liked this study so much, I liked her proposal so much, that I actually approached Jennifer at the end of this course and asked her if she'd actually considered doing the study, and she did. And she did it as a DIS the following semester, and is in the process of writing it up for publication. And I can share that paper with you. But she was into yoga, and she knew that a couple of our PED 101 classes focused on yoga, and she wanted to measure whether those people in that class received any benefits, and she looked at social, emotional, and physical benefits from pre to post. She actually did pre, midterm, and post of people in that yoga class, trying to show that there were benefits from participating in that yoga class. Now that was a great study for her, because it was something that she was very interested in. It was also very manageable, because we had the population and the sample groups already made up, and all we had to do was get permission from the instructor. We had to get IRB permission from UNCW, and off we went. She started collecting the data, we banged it into the computer, we ran our statistics, and we found nothing. Well, we found something, but it wasn't what we wanted to find. But we think we know why we found nothing. And I can talk more about that later on if you want me to. Let's see here. Some of them are very, very scientific-y. And again, the people who proposed these, they didn't actually do the study. Okay? These are just proposals. So some of them you might be thinking, well, how are they going to do that? Well, you don't have to do it. This is just a proposal. So you can propose anything you want. However, if you'd actually like to do the study, then obviously it needs to be manageable. Here's one that's manageable. The effect of exercise intervention on stress levels in college students. So you find a bunch of UNCW college students, you measure their stress levels with some kind of valid, reliable stress measure, and then you take some of them, you do an intervention with them, exercise, and you see if it changes. And maybe you compare it to a control group who didn't do the exercise, or maybe you just compare them to their pre-test scores to see if their stress levels get better from pre to post. That's an experimental type study. Dissatisfaction of body image among exercise science, community health, and non-health majors. The effect of chocolate milk, skim milk, and dark chocolate bar following a glycogen depletion endurance exercise. The effect of Project Unify, which is a program curriculum, on the attitudes of typical high school students regarding inclusion and mainstream of special needs peers. Body composition and the effects of machine versus free weights in resistance training. The effect of 5-hour energy stimulus drink as an ergogenic aid on aerobic capacity. Alright, so start looking at these. Now, I don't want you to copy any of their studies, but it might promote or provoke some kind of response from you. Oh yeah, I'm kind of interested in that, or something similar to a few of these. Let's look at some more. Okay, and you can stop this PowerPoint at any time or look at the PowerPoint notes version of this. I'll give you these whole slides, or these couple of slides, so you can take some time to look over these. Okay, so even though these lectures are hour and 10, hour and 15 minutes long, you've got time to stop and look over these. Caitlin, perceived behaviors and motivational levels of coaches and players within successful D1 soccer programs. The effect of PNF versus static stretching on flexibility and performance on the 40-meter sprint test in college athletes. A comparison of two nutritional plans elementary level, a traditional plan versus a new healthy eating plan. An examination of North Carolina high school varsity coaches' general knowledge of sport-related concussions. Do K-5 classroom teachers who attend a yoga workshop incorporate yoga activities into their classes? How do PE teachers encourage physical activity outside the classroom? The effects of different music on athletic performance. The comparison of UNCW majors on health-related behavior choices and BMI. That was an interesting study. Kristen picked 6 majors from across campus. She proposed that she would survey all those 6 majors and compare some answers on a survey that was related to health choices, such as alcohol, tobacco, sex, stuff, and their BMI, and said she wanted to compare all those majors to each other. So here, the independent variable would be the type of major. The dependent variable would be the choices and BMI, because that's what you measure in, and the participants would be the people in the different majors. Alright, last slide with some examples. The relationship between poverty and childhood obesity. A comparison of vegetable preferences among elementary and college students. Fascinating titles and studies, some of these. Haley looked at, do girls get more practice time in single-sex versus co-ed PE classes? She wanted to go watch single-sexed and co-ed PE classes and look at how active girls were in each of those classes. She was interested in that because she knows what the law says, she knows what my personal philosophy is, and she wanted to go check it out, see if there was any difference in what girls were experiencing in those 2 types of classes. Lainey was a health student. She looked at the effects of a 100% smoke and tobacco-free college campuses has on students, faculty, and staff, a qualitative study. Jared, does the use of heart rate monitors increase student intensity during a middle school PE class? So he wanted to compare some classes that used heart rate monitors against some classes that didn't use heart rate monitors and look at whether there was any effect on intensity. So here the dependent variable would be student intensity, the independent variable would be the use of heart rate monitors, and the subjects in the study would be middle school PE students. Okay, so let's talk about some other important things within a study. Delimitations. Delimitations refer to the scope of the study. They set the boundaries for the research, in effect fencing it in. For example, delimitations include characteristics of a study such as the type of research participants, the number of research participants, the measures to be collected, the instruments utilized in the study, time and duration of the study, the setting, and the type of intervention being used. So some examples are provided on page 40, and you have to have a delimitation section in your research proposal, and you'll see that once I give you the criteria for the proposal. The following examples illustrate delimitations that were included in a thesis focusing on participation in Special Olympics. Number 1. 62 adults with mild to moderate levels of mental retardation. Individuals who reside in northeast Iowa. The experimental group consisted of athletes who participated in the Special Olympics Spring Games that took place in March in northeast Iowa. The Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale, a 2-week interval for pre-post administration. So it's telling us, or it's kind of fencing the study in, and it's saying these are the things that were under the control of the researcher. Limitations. similar to delimitations, but they focus on potential weaknesses. So this is kind of where you want to identify up front, these are the things that could have caused my study to provide incorrect results. So these are things that the researcher could not control but might have influenced the results of the study. Some examples include the sampling problems, some uncontrollable other factors, faulty design, some problems with the instruments that were used, and then some of your internal external validities being compromised. Again, limitations are aspects of the research study that the investigator cannot control, that represent weaknesses to the study and may negatively affect the results. Assumptions are conditions that the researcher presumes to be true. They are to be taken for granted. We can make assumptions about the motivation of the subjects, whether they responded truthfully, the validity of the measuring instrument, and whether subjects followed directions correctly. So in the Special Olympics study example, the following assumptions were made. This is on page 42. The test instrument as modified was appropriate for the target population and was a valid and reliable measure of self-esteem. We're assuming that. The participants understood the directions as they were intended. The participants completed the self-esteem inventory to the best of their ability. The participants were a representative sample of adults with mental retardation who reside in the state of Iowa. The interviewers were sufficiently trained and capable of utilizing the recommended survey procedures. All research participants completed the questionnaire honestly and correctly. The research participants complied with the investigator's request to put forth maximal effort on all trials of the test. Okay, so we're making assumptions that we believe to be true and in place. So variables. We'll start talking a lot about variables in the next few lectures. Broadly defined, a variable is a characteristic, trait, or attribute of a person or a thing that can take on more than one value that can be classified or measured. And we often talk about things like someone's attitude, or their gender, their heart rate, their hair color, anything about a person or thing that can take on more than one value that we can categorize. Within a study, we talked about different types of variables. The main two that we're going to start looking at, and take it to the bank, these questions are going to appear on test 1. You've got to understand the difference between independent and dependent variables, and you've got to be able to recognize in some research questions or problems what the independent variable is and what the dependent variable is. So let's define these. Independent variables are variables that are presumed to influence another variable. The independent variable is under the study or the control of the researcher. The researcher can manipulate the independent variable. The dependent variable is the variable that is expected to change as a result of the manipulation of the independent variable. It's what we're measuring in the study. When I took my research class as a first-year master's student, the instructor said the easiest way to remember this is the independent you're in control of. Independent in control of. So you're in control of the independent variable. You can manipulate it. Okay, you can set up your groups for different levels of the independent variable. The dependent variable depends on the independent variable. The dependent variable that's what's expected to change as a result of the independent variable. It's what we're measuring in the study. Some other types of variables before we come back to the independent dependent variable. Extraneous variables. These are variables that could contribute to some type of error in a research study. There's different names for these, such as confounding variable, intervening variable, or modifying variable. But these are error-producing variables that we should try to control if we can. But there's a trade-off here, because the more we try to control these other variables, the more we move towards highly controlled lab settings. And the more we move to highly controlled lab settings that control for extraneous variables, the more we move away from real-world situations and our ability to generalize. So we get into this trade-off of having stronger internal validity but losing our strength in external validity, which we'll talk about in another lecture. So yes, we want to do our research in the real world to have good external validity, generalizability, but no, we don't want to have other variables affecting our study and damaging the internal validity of the study. So let's go back for these last 4 or 5 slides to independent variables and dependent variables. Let's look at the question and see if you can point out the independent variable and dependent variables in these examples. So number 1. Actually, before we do that, let's go to page 45 if you've got it open in front of you, and I'll give you some examples. We'll go through these first, then we'll do the ones on this slide. Okay, so let me go back to this slide here. A study is designed to investigate the effects of different brands of toothpaste, e.g. Colgate and Crest, on the prevention of dental cavities. A study is designed to investigate the effects of different brands of toothpaste, e.g. Colgate and Crest, on the prevention of dental cavities. What do you think the independent variable is right there? What do you think the dependent variable is right there? Well, the independent variable is the brand of toothpaste, because you're in control of that, and there's 2 levels within that independent variable, Colgate and Crest. The dependent variable is the number of cavities, because you're looking at the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. A researcher wants to compare a dosage of 1200 mg versus 2400 mg of a popular over-the-counter pain reliever on delayed onset muscle soreness following an intense exercise bout. So here the independent variable would be the dosage level. The dependent variable would be some measure of muscle soreness. Page 45, problem 3. An investigator seeks to study the effects of different types of incentives on participation in a weight loss program. The independent variable would be the type of incentive. The dependent variable would be participation rates. A study is undertaken to investigate the effects of a movement education program on motor skill development among preschool children. The independent variable is the movement education program. The dependent variable is some measure of motor skill development. So you need to become skilled and competent in reading research problems and picking out what the independent and dependent variables are. And there's 3 more on page 46. I'm not going to read them to you, but I would encourage you to do that. So read this example on the slide and tell me what you think. If skin cancer is related to ultraviolet light, then people with a high exposure to ultraviolet light will have a higher frequency of skin cancer. If you designed a study around that question, what would your independent variable be? What would your dependent variable be? Well, what you're trying to find out is the frequency of skin cancer, so that would be your dependent variable. Your independent variable here would be the amount of exposure to UV light. So you might design a study where you look at people who have skin cancer and people who don't, and then look at their previous exposure to ultraviolet light. If athletic injuries are related to the type of warm-up, then a dynamic warm-up will result in fewer injuries. Well, I think the dependent variable is probably the easiest to pick out here because it's the amount of injuries. That's what you're measuring. The independent variable that you're in control of is the type of warm-up. So maybe you have 2 or 3 different types of warm-up that you put people into, and then you look at the injuries that those groups sustain. If a teacher's attitude towards using technology affects the quality of his or her instruction, then students in classes taught by teachers with more positive attitudes will learn more technology skills. So if that's your problem, what would your independent and dependent variables be? Read it again on your own. Okay, so the dependent variable here would be students' technology skills. What might affect the students' technology skills is the teacher's attitudes towards technology. So the independent variable would be type of attitude, maybe good attitude, medium attitude, bad attitude, and then you're looking at the effect of that independent variable with those 3 different levels on the dependent variable, which is student technology skills. Couple more. If reading at home with parents improves children's reading ability, then children who read with their parents will become better readers. Okay, dependent variable is easy to pick out. It's what you're measuring. It's the kid's reading ability. The independent variable is whether or not the parents read with their kids at home. This could be an interesting one. You could do this a couple of different ways. You could do some kind of descriptive study or relationship study where you send out a survey to a whole bunch of parents, and one of your questions asks them how many minutes per week do you read with your child, and you could put it like 0 to 15 minutes, 15 to 30, 30 to 45, 45 to 60, 60 to 75, so you could have these different ranges. So then you could collect data on the ranges, and then for those same parents you could test their kids somehow or ask them what their kids' reading level is, and then you could look at, is there a relationship between how much the parents read to how much how well the kids do on reading tests. Or you could do an experimental study looking at differences. You could take you could randomly find 100 parents with kids. You could randomly assign those to different groups, maybe 4 groups. You tell one group, 25 parents and kids, I don't want you to read at all to your kids for the next 4 weeks. Next group, I want you to read 30 minutes a night. Next group, an hour a night. And then the 4th group, 2 hours a night. Okay, that might be extreme, but you see the differences in the 4 groups. If you randomly select, randomly assign at the start, you can be fairly confident that there's no differences to begin with if your sample size is big enough. So your independent variable would be the amount of reading that parents do with their children. Your dependent variable would be the students' reading levels, which you measure at the end. That would maybe lead you to answering that question. If smoking causes cancer, then heavy smokers will have a higher incidence of cancer. Read that one again and answer the question. If smoking causes cancer, then heavy smokers will have a higher incidence of cancer. Dependent variable, incidence of cancer. Independent variable would be amount of smoking. That would have to be some kind of data difference question or a descriptive study, because you wouldn't be able to set up a study where you tell people to smoke more, because that's obviously a threat to their health based on what we know from previous research. If listening to music affects workout intensity, then certain types of music will have a greater impact on heart rate. Dependent variable, heart rate. Independent variable, type of music. Okay, so that wraps up the lecture on understanding the research process. Throughout this lecture, we've looked at the various steps of the research process, noting that there's several steps which vary according to the nature and purpose of the research being conducted, but it usually always involves identifying the research question, defining the problem, searching the literature, stating a hypothesis, designing a plan, and analyzing and interpreting results. We talked about different types of research questions. Descriptive questions are used to obtain descriptive information. Difference questions are used to make comparisons. And relationship questions seek to identify associations between variables. We looked at factors that must be considered when selecting a research question, and said that a good research question should not only focus on a problem of interest, but it should also address a worthwhile problem that holds some value for the discipline. It should also be manageable, both in terms of the scope of the research and the resources available. And then finally, we looked at different types of variables. Independent variables are carefully controlled or manipulated by the researcher. Dependent variables are those upon which measures are collected. So, that concludes this lecture on understanding the research process. We're at about an hour and 12 or 13 minutes. That gives you enough time to stop this a couple of times. Take notes on the missing sections on the PowerPoint skeletal version I give you, to look at the book chapter, and to make sure you understand this content the best you can, and to start really thinking deliberately about any research questions or ideas that you have for your research proposal. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you for the next lecture.